You hear the word security or, national security everywhere, right? In the news, political debates. And sometimes, honestly, it feels like these terms are deployed specifically to, shut down discussion. Like it's something vital, maybe a little shadowy, something out of a movie, and definitely not for you, the everyday citizen, to really dig into.
And that feeling that it's somehow out of reach or just too complex, that can be a real barrier, can't it? A barrier to understanding some of the most critical issues facing the world today.
Absolutely. But your sources, the material you've given us for this deep dive, they argue that understanding security is anything but off limits.
No, quite the opposite.
In fact, they suggest it's essential. So our mission right now, tailored just for you, is to cut through some of that complexity. We're going to unpack what security really means in the contemporary world by diving deep into the texts you've shared.
Yeah, let's try and pull out the most important insights and probably some surprising facts, too, to help you get truly well informed on this really fundamental concept.
And the very first insight your sources deliver is, I think, crucial. Security isn't some simple, fixed idea.
Not at all.
It's described as a slippery concept, one whose meaning can change dramatically depending on the context, the specific situation, and importantly, who you ask.
So how do we even begin to define something so, fluid? Let's look at where your sources start. At its most basic level, security feels like freedom from threats.
Okay, that seems intuitive enough.
Yeah.
Simple.
But your sources immediately flag the challenge with that simple idea, the sheer scope of it.
Right. If literally every possible threat counted like the tiny risk you take just walking out your front door.
Yeah, exactly.
The world would just be a constant, overwhelming cascade of security issues. We'd be paralyzed.
Precisely. So your sources explain that discussions about security are usually narrowed down quite a bit. They focus only on things that threaten what are called core values.
Okay. Core values. That makes sense as a way to filter it.
Yeah.
But then the crucial question your sources prompt is, whose core values? Are we talking about the core values of the country as a whole? Or the core values of ordinary people?
Yeah.
The individuals living within those borders.
And do governments and the citizens they represent always agree on what those core values even are, or which ones are most under threat?
Good point. And the sources add another layer too, right? Intensity.
Yes, intensity. It's not just any small threat to a core value. To qualify as a proper security issue, the threat has to be, extremely dangerous.
Extremely dangerous.
Right.
Something that could damage those core values beyond repair if it's not addressed decisively. Really serious stuff.
So it's a truly existential threats to fundamental things.
Exactly. And this brings us right back to that slippery nature we mentioned. Societies haven't always had the same understanding of security throughout history.
And even today, across different cultures and nations, you find wildly different views on what matters most. Which is why your sources introduce a really helpful framework, I think, to organize these different ideas. They generally group conceptions of security into two main types, traditional and non-traditional.
Okay, traditional and non-traditional.
And the traditional view is probably where most people's minds go first when they hear security. It's fundamentally state-centric.
Right. So in this traditional lens, the main focus is external threats. Danger is seen as coming mainly from other countries.
Yes, and specifically military threats from other states. These are seen as endangering the fundamental core values of a state itself, its sovereignty, its independence, its territorial integrity.
But it's not just abstract state concepts, is it? These threats directly endanger the lives of ordinary citizens, too. War isn't contained to the battlefield.
Not at all. Civilians are often on the front lines of suffering in modern conflict.
So what does a government, thinking in this traditional way, do when faced with the threat of war? Your sources outline three basic responses.
Well, there's surrender, which, as the sources dryly note, isn't usually an advertised policy.
No, probably not.
Then there's deterrence, the strategy of preventing an attack by making it crystal clear to the potential aggressor that the cost
of launching that attack would be unacceptably high.
Right.
Exactly. And the third is defense, actually fighting back if war does break out, with the goal of denying the attacker their objectives, repelling the invasion.
Okay. Deterrence and defense.
So at its heart, traditional security policy is about preventing war through deterrence and, managing or ending it through defense.
And how do countries actually build and maintain this traditional security against external military threats? Your sources point to two key mechanisms: power and relationships.
Yeah. First, there's the concept of the balance of power. Countries are incredibly sensitive to the military strength of others, particularly neighbors or rivals.
Always looking over their shoulder.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They constantly maneuver to maintain a balance that they see as favorable to themselves. This involves building military power, of course, but also the underlying economic and technological strength that supports it. And then there's alliance building. This is where countries form coalitions, often formalized by treaties,
to coordinate their actions for deterrence or defense.
Exactly.
Alliances pool resources and increase a country's effective power relative to others.
But your sources make a really critical point here. These alliances are based on national interests, and those interests can shift dramatically over time. They're not set in stone.
They give a really striking example, don't they? The U.S. supporting Islamic militants in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. Then, decades later, after the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. found itself attacking some of those same militant groups.
The national interest changed completely, and so did who was considered an ally or a threat. It shows how fluid these things are.
So why this heavy external focus in the traditional view? Where does that come from?
It stems from a specific perspective on the international system, unlike within a country, where there's usually a central government capable of enforcing laws and controlling violence.
The international system is seen as anarchic. No world government. Exactly, lacking that central authority. While the UN exists, its power is limited, dependent on its member states. So, the thinking goes, each country feels it must ultimately rely on its own capabilities for security against external threats.
Okay, makes sense. And within this traditional military-focused view, your sources also touch on other related ideas.
Yeah, things like the trust placed in countries with nuclear weapons, the potential sort of paradox in the term peacekeeping force.
And just the terrible destruction war inevitably brings.
Right. Now, while traditional security is dominated by external military threats, your sources also pose a crucial question. How secure can a country truly be from outside dangers if it's unstable or insecure inside its own borders?
Good point. Internal peace and order are fundamentally linked to external security, aren't they?
Absolutely. The domestic situation matters deeply. The source notes that after World War II, for major powers like the U.S. and in Western Europe, internal security felt largely assured.
Right, so their focus shifted outwards, to the Cold War mainly.
Primarily, yes. Yet even these powers weren't immune to internal issues. Your sources mention European colonial powers facing violent resistance within their empires, like the French in Vietnam or the British in Kenya.
And then, as waves of colonies gained independence from the late 1940s onwards, their security landscapes often looked significantly different from that Western model.
Oh, absolutely. They faced traditional threats from neighbors, conflicts over borders, resources, that sort of thing.
But they also grappled intensely with threats from within internal military conflicts, especially from separatist movements trying to carve out new countries.
And often these external and internal threats kind of blurred together, didn't they, with neighboring states potentially supporting internal insurgencies.
Yeah, it gets messy.
Your sources highlight a truly staggering shift here. Internal wars now account for over 95% of armed conflicts worldwide.
95%, wow.
There was something like a 12-fold rise in civil wars between 1946 and 1991 alone. For these new states, managing internal conflict alongside potential external threats was arguably the defining security challenge.
And the sources even suggest internal conflict can be rooted in deep insecurity or unhappiness within the country itself.
That's right. It's not just about power grabs.
So while starting with the state and military force, the traditional view, especially when you look at newer states, clearly acknowledges the critical importance of internal stability, too.
Definitely. And even within this traditional view, which, let's face it, sees military force as both the main problem and the main solution. Your sources point out that there's also a recognition of the need for cooperation between states to limit violence.
Okay, cooperation even within the traditional military framework.
Yes. This applies to both the ends, the acceptable reasons for war, usually self-defense or maybe preventing genocide, and the means how war is fought, emphasizing avoiding civilian harm, using force only as a last resort, those kinds of principles.
And beyond just setting limits, the sources detail specific mechanisms for this kind of cooperation.
They do. Disarmament is one where states agree to actually eliminate certain categories of weapons.
Like biological or chemical weapons.
Exactly. Your sources cite the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention and the 1992 Chemical Weapons Convention. They banned production and possession, widely joined, including by major powers.
Not nuclear weapons, right? The sources note the superpowers held on to those.
Crucially, no. Which brings us to arms control, which is more about regulating the acquisition or development of weapons rather than outright elimination.
So things like limits on missile defense systems or numbers of strategic weapons.
Yes, examples like the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM Treaty, SALT II, they focused on those strategic nuclear weapons between the superpowers.
And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, how does that fit?
Well, the NPT from 1968, perhaps the most well-known treaty, is highlighted by your sources not really as abolishing nuclear weapons, but as regulating who could possess them.
So it essentially locked in the existing nuclear powers.
The ones who had tested before 1967, yeah, and tried to prevent others from joining the club.
It feels like a complex landscape, making weapons and then making these really complicated rules about them.
It is. The sources include a cartoon that sort of dryly captures this paradox, suggesting security almost becomes about navigating these complex rules, not necessarily eliminating the underlying danger itself.
Interesting. And the third mechanism for cooperation?
Confidence building. This is a process where rival countries share information about their military intentions, their plans, forces, deployments.
Why would they do that?
The aim is to increase transparency, build a bit of trust, and crucially, avoid accidental war caused by misunderstanding or misperception, trying to prevent stumbling into conflict.
Okay, so wrapping up the traditional view. It's fundamentally centered on military force, seeing it as both the main danger and the main tool for security, although it does include mechanisms for managing and limiting that force through cooperation.
That sums it up well. But as the world changed, especially after the Cold War ended, this state-centric, military-focused view began to feel, well, insufficient to many people.
Right, it didn't seem to cover everything that felt like a threat.
Exactly. And this is where non-traditional notions of security emerge in your sources.
These ideas dramatically expand the scope of what counts as a threat, don't they? Looking far beyond military attacks.
To encompass a much wider range of dangers impacting the fundamental conditions of human life, things we might not initially think of as security.
And they pose a fundamental challenge to that question. Security for whom?
Yes. The traditional view, as we said, is primarily focused on the state, its territory, its institutions.
But these non-traditional views broaden that referent, as the sources call it. They argue security should be for individuals, for communities, or maybe even for all of humankind.
And these approaches often get labeled human security or global security.
Okay, let's break those down. Human security.
The core idea here is prioritizing the protection of people over the protection of states. Simple as that, really.
And while a secure state can contribute to the security of its people, your sources offer a truly powerful, honestly unsettling statistic.
The one about governments killing their own people.
Yeah. That in the last 100 years, far more people have been killed, not by foreign armies, but by their own governments.
That single fact really forces a reevaluation, doesn't it, of what security means on an individual level. Protecting individuals becomes the goal.
But even within human security, there are different ideas about what threats to protect people from.
That's right. There's what your sources call the narrow concept, often associated with figures like former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. It focuses primarily on violent threats to individuals.
Particularly from internal violence within their own state, like civil war or government repression.
Exactly. But then there's the broad concept. This camp argues the list of threats must be much longer.
Expanding it to include things like
hunger, disease, natural disasters. Pointing out that these causes kill vastly more people globally than war or terrorism combined.
So it includes economic security, threats to basic human dignity.
Right, often summarized as providing freedom from want and freedom from fear, both aspects.
Your sources have some commentary arguing this broader view represents real security for real human beings. And there's that cartoon questioning the massive spending on defense versus spending on peace initiatives. It really makes you think about what kind of threats truly impact people's daily lives and survival.
It certainly does. Then there's the other label, global security. This concept gained prominence particularly in the 1990s.
Why then?
It was largely in response to threats that are seen as inherently global in scale. things that don't respect borders.
Like global warming, international terrorism.
And major health epidemics. Your sources mention examples like AIDS, bird flu, SARS, things that can spread rapidly worldwide.
And they're called global security issues because no single country, no matter how powerful, can solve them alone.
Right, precisely. They cross borders naturally. Their impacts can be felt everywhere, even if some countries face disproportionate risks like the Maldives or Bangladesh facing sea level rise due to climate change.
So international cooperation isn't just helpful for these, it's absolutely vital.
Vital, even if achieving that cooperation is often really difficult in practice, as we know.
Your sources go into more detail on several specific examples of these new, non-traditional sources of threat. Terrorism is a key one.
Yeah, defined as political violence deliberately targeting civilians indiscriminately. And international terrorism involves citizens or territory of more than one country.
The goal is political change through force or threat, often by terrorizing the wider public via attacks on civilian targets.
Classic tactics like hijackings, bombings. While attention surged after 9/11 2001, your sources rightly remind us that terrorism isn't new. It's been a tactic used in various regions for decades.
There's a cartoon mentioned, using the simple act of taking the train, that kind of captures that feeling of vulnerability terrorism creates in everyday life.
Human rights are another big area in non-traditional security. Your sources classify them broadly.
Political rights, like speech and assembly.
Economic and social rights.
And the rights of minorities or colonized peoples.
And while that categorization is widely accepted, there's significant debate, as your sources point out, about which rights are truly universal, and maybe more contentiously, what the international community should do when these rights are violated on a massive scale.
Yeah, intervention is always tricky. Events since the 1990s, the sources mention the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, the Rwandan genocide, violence in East Timor. They really spurred debate about UN intervention, didn't they? Even military intervention.
Huge debates. Some argue the UN Charter actually empowers intervention in such cases, but others contend that decisions to intervene are often driven more by the national interests of powerful states than by pure humanitarian concern.
There's that cartoon questioning why human rights violations often seem to be highlighted elsewhere, implying a potential blind spot for powerful nations regarding their own actions or those of their allies.
A critical perspective, yeah. Then there's global poverty, presented as a fundamental source of insecurity.
Your sources link rapid population growth, especially in the global south, with these vast economic disparities.
The rich getting richer, the poor struggling or falling further behind. It contributes to the north-south divide, but also fuels severe inequalities within countries in the south.
And there's a stark link made to conflict.
Yes. Your sources note that most armed conflicts now occur in sub-Saharan Africa, the world's poorest region. At the turn of the century, it saw more war deaths than the rest of the world combined. Poverty and conflict seem deeply intertwined.
And poverty in the South is also a major driver of migration towards the North, as people seek better opportunities, which creates its own political friction.
It does, and your sources clarify those important distinctions international law makes. Migrants who move voluntarily.
Refugees who are fleeing war, disaster, or persecution, and whose states are generally expected to accept and protect.
And internally displaced people, or IDPs, people who flee their homes but remain within their own country's borders. The sources give the Kashmiri Pandits as an example.
And there's a strong correlation highlighted between war and refugee flows. Millions created, mostly linked to internal conflicts in recent decades. It shows how insecurity in one place just spills over.
Absolutely. Health epidemics are another powerful example your sources use for non-traditional threats.
Diseases spreading rapidly across borders now because of travel, trade.
Exactly. Success or failure in controlling a disease in one country directly impacts others. We've seen that very clearly.
The sources give specific examples. HIV/AIDS with its global reach but concentration in Africa and South Asia, and the huge disparity in access to treatment.
Also, new or poorly understood diseases like Ebola or hepatitis C, and older diseases like TB or malaria mutating into drug-resistant forms.
Even animal epidemics like mad cow disease or bird flu are mentioned because they can have massive economic effects.
All these health examples really underscore our growing interdependence. Borders mean less against these kinds of threats. They highlight the urgent need for international cooperation.
The sources suggest mapping these threats onto a place like Africa to see their combined impact. And there's a cartoon prompting reflection on how the world should even begin to address such diverse issues.
Now, even with this much broader view of security, your sources bring back that idea of coherence, Not every problem is a security issue.
Right, there has to be a threshold.
To qualify, an issue must still threaten the very existence of the referent. Whether that's the state or a specific group of people, it has to be existential.
But the nature of that existential threat can vary hugely depending on the context.
Exactly. For the Maldives, the sources say, it's rising sea levels threatening to literally submerge the nation. That's existential.
For Southern Africa, maybe HIV/AIDS poses that kind of existential threat because its prevalence is so devastating.
And for the Tutsi in Rwanda, the threat was genocide, a direct, violent threat to their existence as a group. So non-traditional security, just like traditional security, is deeply contextual.
Okay, so if traditional security relies heavily on military force, how do you actually address these non-traditional threats like poverty, disease, climate change? Military force doesn't seem like the right tool.
No, your sources make a compelling case that for many of these issues, military force is simply ineffective or even counterproductive.
You can't bomb a virus or defeat poverty with tanks, can you?
Pretty much sums it up. Instead, the sources suggest that far more effective strategies involve deep international cooperation.
Working together across borders.
Yes. Bilaterally, regionally, continentally, or globally, whatever scale fits the problem.
And this cooperative security involves many more actors than just states, doesn't it?
A much wider range. It brings in powerful international organizations, the UN, the WHO, the World Bank. The IMF are mentioned alongside a vast network of non-governmental organizations, NGOs.
Like Amnesty International, the Red Cross, charities, unions.
And even influential individuals and businesses. It's a multi-stakeholder effort.
Now, what about military force? Does it have any role in non-traditional security?
Well, the sources suggest it might still be used in certain contexts, like maybe counterterrorism or potentially in response to mass human rights violations.
But it's better if it's collective.
Yes, far more legitimate and likely more effective when it's sanctioned and applied collectively by the international community, rather than just one country acting unilaterally based on its own judgment.
Okay. So to bring this all together, your sources offer India's security strategy as a kind of real-world case study, right? Showing how a country grapples with this mix of threats.
Exactly. And India has certainly faced both traditional and non-traditional dangers, internally and externally. A complex picture.
According to the source, India's approach has 4 main components. The first is pretty traditional, maintaining and strengthening its military capabilities.
Seen as necessary because of its history of conflicts with neighbors. The sources list them. Pakistan in 47-48, 65-71-99, China in 62.
And they frame India's decision to conduct nuclear tests in 1998, after an initial test back in 74, in this light.
Yes, as a response to being in a region with other nuclear-armed states, seeing it as a crucial element of national security in that traditional deterrent sense.
Okay, component 1, military strength. What's second?
Second is strengthening international norms and institutions. Your sources highlight India's historical commitment here, going back to figures like Nehru supporting Asian solidarity, decolonization, disarmament, the UN itself.
So actively working within the international system.
Yes. Pushing for things like a universal, non-discriminatory, non-proliferation regime, arguing for fairer rules on nuclear weapons. Advocating for a more equitable global economic order, using non-alignment during the Cold War to stay out of superpower blocs.
And participating in global efforts like climate change agreements, contributing troops to UN peacekeeping.
All part of that second component, engaging with the international community.
The third component focuses inwards, meeting internal security challenges.
Dealing with militant movements seeking secession in regions like Nagaland, Mizoram, Punjab, Kashmir, as listed in the sources.
And the core strategy here, as described, isn't just military force.
No. Crucially, it involves using India's democratic political system to manage these challenges. The idea is to allow different groups to voice grievances, participate politically, share power.
Aiming to preserve national unity through political inclusion, not just suppression.
That seems to be the strategy outlined, yeah.
And the fourth and final component.
Economic development. This is framed as an attempt to lift millions of citizens out of poverty and misery and to reduce the huge economic inequalities that persist.
Your sources acknowledge this hasn't fully succeeded, right? India still faces significant poverty and inequality.
They do acknowledge that, but they draw a crucial link. The democratic system allows the voices of the poor and marginalized to be heard, at least theoretically.
Creating pressure on elected governments.
To pursue economic growth alongside human development. So democracy itself is viewed as a potential mechanism for providing greater security by addressing some of the root causes of discontent and instability.
Interesting link between democracy and security there. Your sources also include a cartoon contrasting spending on nuclear weapons versus family security and that idea of world blindness, a strong visual point.
And there's a note prompting you, the listener, to compare national spending on traditional versus non-traditional security, a thought-provoking exercise based on everything we've discussed.
Definitely food for thought. So, reflecting on everything in your source material, we've really taken a journey, haven't we, from a relatively narrow view of security.
Heavily focused on states facing external military threats.
To a much broader, much more multi-layered understanding, one that includes the security of individuals, communities, humanity as a whole.
Facing global threats like poverty, disease, environmental challenges, internal instability, a much wider range of dangers.
And dealing with those broader threats, as your sources make clear, often requires very different tools, primarily international cooperation involving lots of different actors compared to traditional military might.
Yeah, the toolkit has to expand significantly.
It's undeniably complex, isn't it?
Yep.
And as your sources kept emphasizing, what constitutes security truly does depend heavily on context. The specific threats a state or group faces, whether they are internal or external, military or non-military.
It's not a one-size-fits-all concept. And perhaps the most powerful idea or maybe question left for us by your sources is this. As these global non-traditional threats become more and more pressing, demanding cooperative action.
How do countries balance their traditional focus on national security interests, often defined quite narrowly, with this growing need for a shared, cooperative approach to global security, that inherent tension?
Exactly. Or maybe the sources are pushing us further, suggesting that true security in the 21st century might ultimately depend just as much on things like human development, addressing deep inequalities, and fostering inclusive democratic systems.
Yeah. As it does on tanks, planes, or even nuclear weapons. That cartoon linking war and terrorism suggests a kind of cycle of insecurity. Maybe breaking that cycle requires looking beyond the traditional military lens entirely.
Definitely something to consider.